I'm Seth for Privacy, and thanks so much for joining us on the journey to sovereignty. We're beyond thrilled to have a place for us to chat about all things sovereignty, the why and how we're reclaiming your digital sovereignty, and to give you all a chance to chime in, ask questions, and join the conversation. Journey to Sovereignty is brought to you by Foundation, where we build Bitcoin-centric tools that empower you to reclaim your digital sovereignty. This includes our Passport hardware wallet and Envoy mobile app. If you've heard about ways that Bitcoin nodes can track you or theoretical attacks against your node, we've got you covered in today's episode. We're going to dive into how network privacy works in Bitcoin, what nodes can learn about you, and dive into an active attack against your node that's been going on for the past few months. As always, I'm joined by Bitcoin Q&A, head of customer experience here at Foundation, but we're also joined today by someone I highly respect, Timo, otherwise known as 0xB10C on Twitter. He's been doing fantastic development and research work on Bitcoin and is the perfect person to help us dive into network privacy today and explain an ongoing attack against Bitcoiners' nodes right now. How's it going, guys?
Hey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, doing well, Seth. Thanks for having us on, and pleasure to be here with such esteemed company as well. So looking forward to this one.
Yeah, really going to be a blast and a lot to cover today. So we will probably go a little bit over the hour mark, but we'll keep it under an hour and a half, just as a heads up. So the bulk of today, we are going to cover that ongoing attack that you've discovered, Timo. But before we jump into that, I do want to lay the groundwork for how Bitcoin node privacy works at a basic level, so we can better understand the what, the why, and the how of the current attack that you've been covering. So first off, I want to talk about what information the Bitcoin node your wallet actually connects to learns about your transactions. What are the key things that they can really learn about users when you're connecting to a node from your wallet?
Yeah, I guess I'll kick off, cover off the basics, and Timo can chime in with all of the stuff that I miss off. So, to interact with Bitcoin via any wallet, you need to do so through a node, and if you do that through your own node, then that's one of the best and most private ways you can do that. Most people starting out in the space obviously aren't going to be able to have the technical know-how or patience to be able to run a node. So whenever you're interacting with Bitcoin, you need to do that through a node. And depending on which node you do that, you'll be sharing information with either yourself as your own node runner or with a third party, whoever it is that's hosting that node. So some of the high level stuff that a node that you're connecting your wallet to, some of the information that they'd learn is obviously when your wallet balances, your addresses that are used, the addresses that you're sending to, or in fact all of the transactional information that anybody could look at on a regular block explorer. So all of the information that's contained within that transaction. If your node has not been run over the Tor network, which thankfully most of the run at home nodes do now, then the node runner will learn your IP address, which can also give your approximate geographical location, which theoretically could also be tied back to your in real life identity with your ISP, your internet service provider as well. So if you're not using your own node, then there is quite a lot of information that you're sharing by default, just to do the very basic thing of load a wallet balance or to make a Bitcoin transaction to another Bitcoin user.
And what information, when you do make that transaction, what information does the broader Bitcoin network learn about the source of that transaction? I mean, I know like IP address isn't directly tied to transactions on chain, so there's no information about what node published a transaction or something like that. But what are the pieces of information that the broader Bitcoin network can learn about the source of a transaction, and why is that?
Yeah, I guess I take this one. So when you receive, or actually when you broadcast a transaction, you tell other peers you're connected to, hey, I have this transaction, and do you want it? And the peer says, hey, I don't know it. Please send it to me. And if you're someone, or if you know, okay, if I don't know this transaction, I haven't seen it before. And if you're connected to enough people, then you can say with some certainty, maybe this is where the transaction originated, where it was broadcast from. Obviously, you don't know really if the same person really owns this IP address or belongs to this IP address, but you can make guesses over time and can find out. if that's really if these are really connected.
Yeah, and ultimately that function is necessary for the broader network to properly learn about a transaction. I mean, that's part of the gossip protocol that's used to ensure that miners can see what transactions are available. And it's a vital function of the network and the core way that the peer-to-peer network works. But obviously it can reveal some information about the source node of a transaction. Not intended to, but that can be one of the side effects there.
Right, and there are protections against it. Like it's not super easy to do it. There are some randomness and timings, depending if you're sending a transaction to an outbound or inbound peer. It's a bit different, but there are papers and research that say, hey, we can, I don't know, up to 30% or so of the transactions we can link to the IP address. If that's true in the real world, I'm not sure, but it might be.
Yeah, there's at least a probability involved. It's not a direct deterministic link between source node and transaction for anyone watching on the network.
Correct.
But it's one of those things where they can make guesses, and if they do specific things, they can improve the percentage chance of them guessing correctly. And for most people, that idea of a privacy issue with their node is something that's been really purely theoretical. I mean, there's been research about different attacks that could happen against Bitcoin nodes, about how transactions could be tied to their source node. A lot of work has gone into that from the research perspective, but there hasn't been a whole lot of digging into actual active attacks. But you've been working on uncovering what is actually an active, real-life attack going on today against anyone running a Bitcoin node, Timo. So I'd love it if you can walk us through how you uncovered this and what the core behavior you're seeing going on is.
Okay. I start off way back. So I've been looking at how entities or people behave on the Bitcoin network for a while, and this is not only the P2P networks; it's also the mempool. And I looked at how, for example, big wallets use the mempool, and or big exchanges use the mempool, and what they do, and so on. And at some point, I started looking at what peers connect to my Bitcoin core node and a bit of observability in there. And from there on, I saw that some IP addresses connect really frequently, and especially frequently when my peer slots, like my inbound peer slots, are actually full. This led to me seeing, like, I think at 700 connections per minute inbound, and this got me asking, and I looked into it more. And over time, it got clear to me that this is actually the entity we're talking about today, the linking line, which I call it. And there are, a few different things they're doing. And one of them is they open quite a few connections. And I think that's not really what they want to do, but in some cases, they open like these 700 connections per minute. Which I saw and said, okay, this looks interesting. What are they doing? And can we find out what's actually happening in here? Yeah. So looking at it, I recorded some of the connections or some of the traffic that reached me on my node, and over time, I think this was like 4 or 5 days, and over time, saw like definitely a pattern emerging there. Some really short-lived connections that just connect really briefly after like receiving, hey, I'm a node and I'm alive, and others like other connections staying open for longer and just listening for transactions we tell them.
Yeah, it's interesting that they seem to kind of take a naive approach, or maybe even lazy approach to connecting, where they do create far more connections that are necessary for them to actually perform the surveillance that it seems like they're doing. Do you have any kind of thoughts on why they might do that? If it was just simple, or if there's any kind of extra purpose behind the many connections that they create as part of trying to surveil?
I don't know. I don't think. I'm leaning a bit out of window right now, but I'm not. I'm saying they're not so sophisticated. In some way, they could definitely improve what they're doing. Should I walk you through how this works?
Yeah, I think it'd be great to learn from a basic level kind of how they're able to get information from nodes, just as an inbound connection, not even as an active outbound connection from different nodes in the network.
So the entity linking line, I call it, starts off by just opening a TCP connection to your Bitcoin node, and there is this rule that the inbound connection, like the one opening connection, also sends a version message. A version message in Bitcoin is used in the handshake between two nodes, and the handshake is there to determine like the version both nodes are familiar with speaking, so they speak the same language and know the same messages. And in this version message, the entity uses, like they said, for example, a fake user agent, like to some really old and obscure Bitcoin J wallets, for example, which is, you can clearly see that, and it's definitely something that's odd. Why wouldn't they hide as, I don't know, some recent version of Bitcoin Core or other wallet? And also they have a few things. For example, you tell the other node which block height you're on, and they seem to be lagging behind the real block height in different configurations. That's also one thing you can see. And yeah, there is also like a flag in there in the version message, which says, hey, I want to receive transactions from you, like new transactions. And they set the flag. And yeah, once my node processes the version message from the peer, my node decides, okay, I can speak the same version. I send back a version message too, and also acknowledge that they received the version message. And at this point, it's the entity's turn to either say, hey, I acknowledge the connection and we're good. But what happens is, for, I think, 80% of the connections, actually, the entity never sends the acknowledgement, the VERAC, and just closes the connection. For the other 18% or so, they complete this handshake and say, they not say, okay, we can talk, and Bitcoin Core sends a few messages related to what services the node offers. For example, saying, hey, I want to participate in compact block relay, and also sends a ping message, and the entity responds to the ping message. But other than that, we don't hear back from the entity anymore. It just sits there and listens for, I don't know, up to 2.5 minutes, and in some cases even longer.
And so they go through the process of establishing that handshake, connecting to your node, telling your node a fake user agent to essentially subscribe to your node and get your node to tell them about things that it knows. And you broke it down in your blog into what specifically it tells them, but it's part of that inventory that your node will describe to them, which is things like transactions when you first see them, blocks when you first see them, things like that. Do you think that that's the core of what they're trying to get to, is build those connections so that then they can get information from your node about basically what its view of the network is?
Based on what I've seen, I think yes, that's what one could interpret, and they are trying to do. I don't know if it's really their focus. I think so, but I don't know. I think they could leave these connections open for quite long, for far longer. Nothing stops them from leaving the connection open for an hour or so. I don't know why they're closing it after 2.5 minutes. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the odd pieces of behavior. Is I don't know if it's laziness or there's some aspect of it that just doesn't make sense, that they don't try to maintain connections for longer. But since they are spamming connections so often, I guess that does likely mean that they have an active connection to you through one of the IP addresses used at most of the given points in time.
Right. They also have they also open multiple connections. I have people reporting 10 plus connections they have from the same entity. Yeah, makes sense. you obviously have a better chance of receiving transactions, but yeah, I'm not sure. It's a bit weird, the behavior. Also, what they also do is in some messages they say, okay, hey, send me other addresses of node on the network. So they fill up their, I'd say, database of other nodes to connect to. So eventually they hope, I think they hope to find all listening peers on the network. But I've also heard from people that say, I don't have any connection from them and I've never seen this peer and I haven't banned it. So I'm not sure how good of a job they are doing this.
Yeah, and that's one of the weird things with a network like Bitcoin is obviously we want it to be peer-to-peer, we want it to be permissionless, we want it to be distributed and decentralized, but that does open up risks like this where anyone can run a node, whether they're a good actor or malicious. So why is it important, or why is it possible that an adversary can spin up nodes like these and make malicious connections? I think a lot of people just assume when we're talking surveillance like this that we can just ban them and move on. But within the Bitcoin network, obviously it's intended to be permissionless. So why is it possible that an adversary can actually do this today?
Right. We want this network to be open. You mentioned it, we want this to be permissionless. We don't want to gatekeep anyone from joining the network. And we actually don't know, like, this could be some client, like, I don't think it is, but it could be some client that is misconfigured or is broken in some way, and we don't want to shut it out just because it's broken, which could cause in some point maybe like a split between the nodes on the network saying, hey, I won't connect to you because you're behaving slightly weird, slightly in a way I don't understand why you're doing it, and we don't necessarily want that to happen. We want to communicate as much as possible where we can, given to a point where we say, okay, this node is actually feeding us malicious data or sending us weird stuff, then we're going to close the connection. But other than that, we want to try to stay open for anyone to join.
Yeah, ultimately it would be a permission and centralized network if someone had control over what a node has to look like who joins the network, which would make it easier to protect against attacks like this, but obviously it would have the side effect that you couldn't just spin up a node and join the network without anyone's permission, without emailing someone, without doing anything like that, which is a key aspect of how Bitcoin actually works and how we can do this in a way that doesn't rely on a central entity or government. And it's been interesting watching like the Tor network, who have had an ongoing civil and distributed denial of service attack for the last 7 or 8 months at least. They have similar problem where the network has to be permissionless in order for it to work and to provide anonymity in their case rather than decentralized money. But because it is distributed and decentralized and permissionless, it's very hard to prevent these types of attacks because you really do have to kind of assume goodwill initially of nodes that join the network, and then watch their behavior. And maybe from there, you can ban them on an individual peer level. But it makes things a lot trickier when we can't just centralize and control this sort of thing. So a lot of benefit comes with it, but it's a clear trade-off too.
Right, and we want to make it a bit harder. For example, we say if you're like, we don't connect to I'd say our outbound connections don't go, preferably don't go to nodes in the same data center, for example. So we want to make sure that we can do the maximum in terms of protecting who we connect to and so on. But at some point, obviously, like a really motivated attacker could do like a really big Sybil attack, controlling nodes in like all over the globe, and get us to only connect to them and so on. But we try to spread out our connections that we make as far as possible.
Yeah, and because this specific entity doesn't seem to be seeking to be the outbound nodes that you're connecting to, you don't think that this is also an attempted Sybil attack where they are trying to be the majority of the peers that you're connecting to on the network and thus provide malicious data. It seems to be just kind of an inbound side surveillance effort rather than the kind of Sybil attack that is another commonly talked about attack on a permissionless network like this.
Yeah, correct. I don't think they, at least, okay, let me clarify, at least on the IP addresses and the IP address blocks I've looked at, they're not accepting inbound connections at all. And they're actually doing like using the ports that you would host, for example, your Bitcoin node on, for example, the H263 port. They're using this port to open outbound connections as well, which is not default in most Linux systems, but you can do if you configure it to do so. So I don't think they're using the same IP addresses as least to accept inbound connections and be your Sybil node, for your outbounds you create. I've heard from a Monero developer that actually, let's actually speak about this. The same entity has been opening connections on the Monero network as well. And there they send you information about their own IP addresses or some of the IP addresses you should open connections to, which is also interesting. And I think like hearing that the entity is active on both networks makes it far more likely to be someone that isn't doing just some experiment, but also really like looking to learn about the network and transactions and stuff on the network, maybe even for like a financial gain or something.
Yeah, if you've just kind of accidentally built a broken Bitcoin client, you wouldn't also be connecting to Monero nodes out there, which is a totally different peer-to-peer approach, different protocol, different API. It's completely separate. So the fact that those same IP addresses have been known to actively attack Monero nodes as well in the past. And I think that's going back a couple years now that we've been seeing these IP addresses in the Monero space, where, like you said, these nodes have been essentially attempting to Sybil attack nodes by providing you a peer list that is only their malicious peers to try to get your node to only connect to their nodes. And then they can ultimately use that to try and surveil the, essentially tie the transaction ID, which even in Monero, it doesn't reveal a lot of information, but it does reveal at least when that transaction ID was sent and potentially the source node as well. Obviously, Monero has some broader protections because we implement Dandelion++ there, which maybe we can get into a little bit at the end of today's chat. But it's a very similar attack from a different angle, where they're still trying to surveil transactions and tie them to IP addresses and source nodes, but they're doing it in a way that's more akin to a traditional Sybil attack, where they're trying to become all of your outbound peers, if at all possible, so they have a better chance of being able to see the origin of a transaction there. So it was crazy, and I'm glad that you reached out to me about that, because it ended up being a really good connection around this topic. But it's interesting that same entity has been attacking both Monero and now Bitcoin from the same IP addresses with somewhat analogous behavior as well.
Right. Yeah, behavior is a bit different, but definitely similar. Yeah. One idea could be that this is like one theory is that these IP address ranges are VPN endpoints, and they are just two companies or two different customers of this VPN endpoint using the same ranges. And yeah, definitely possible. We don't know yet, or we might never know.
Yeah, it will be hard to ascertain if it is for sure the same entity, but it also has a pretty obscure VPN service, which would again indicate that it's likely the same entity, even if they are using the same VPN. But yeah, it's something where we can't narrow it down exactly. We really can just kind of hypothecate on what could be happening there. But I want to dive a little bit into the practical implications of this. If we are assuming that they are attempting to surveil the things that we're doing with our Bitcoin nodes, the transactions we're sending, what do they learn about us and how we use Bitcoin when they're performing this attack against our nodes?
So one thing, besides learning about like you're linking your transaction to your IP addresses, obviously, like if they open frequent connections, they can track when you go offline, when you come back online. When you upgrade your node, for example, they also see if you're like on a pruned node or not. But that's all metadata, and that's not actually too hard to find out over other ways. Like like for example, there is like the Bitnode site or so that lists peers and their uptime and downtime, and other people like checking for connectivity on the network and so on. That's something else I find out. I think the main thing here that they could find out is like how the transaction propagates to the network, where they originate, and who sent them from which IP address.
Yeah, and ultimately, even if they only learn the source IP and the transaction ID that's tied to it, I think what a lot of people forget is that that can be combined with other on-chain surveillance to provide a very broad picture of a user's usage of Bitcoin. So this is something that we speculated about for a long time. I think in 2015, there was a big fuss over Chainalysis supposedly doing this type of attack and trying to tie IP addresses to wallet clusters on-chain. But it's one of those situations where the default transparency of Bitcoin can be even more harmful when an entity can perform this type of active attack and tie a source IP to a transaction ID and then ultimately to a wallet cluster and make a very holistic picture about someone's usage of Bitcoin. And ultimately, IP address may or may not be a big deal. I mean, if it's if you're running a Bitcoin node at home, you're not running it behind Tor. Ultimately, they're getting your home IP address, which gives rough geographical location, what ISP you use. It can give a lot of information about you. But if you're using like a good non-logging VPN, at worst, it reveals that VPN provider that you're using. If you're running only behind Tor, all it reveals is that you're running behind Tor. It doesn't reveal any true IP address. So that definitely can vary, and there are protections about that I want to dive into next. But there's a lot that goes into that because it's not just this standalone piece of data. It's often that this type of data, especially by like chain analysis companies who can sell this data to the highest bidder, sell it to law enforcement, governments, whoever they want to, essentially. They can combine this IP address and transaction ID data with other on-chain tracing, because then they can look at the data within that transaction, like the inputs, the outputs, the amounts, when you sent it, and build a much bigger picture around you there. But anything else to add on like the practical implications of this type of surveillance?
I think there is a bit we don't know yet about that people like that companies are doing. Maybe we will learn about in a few years or so. But yeah, I definitely think this is a possibility that the people are doing this and have been doing for quite a while on the network.
Yeah, definitely. And we touched a little bit on the possible incentives or motives here, but was there anything else you wanted to mention there, Timo, about like what some maybe legitimate situations here could be, or who maybe doesn't need to do this because they have visibility into connections between source IP and transaction in other ways?
Of course, like they are researchers and like academics and that do these kind of experiments from time to time. Maybe they want to write a paper about like transaction propagation, or they have some monitoring for transaction propagation. And actually, I've recently seen a conversation from a few Bitcoin developers about the topic of like why is transaction propagation slowing down a bit, and they use stats like these or collected in similar ways probably to figure out like how to improve it and at least see it and discuss it that there are problems. Because like higher propagation times, transaction propagation times could indicate a problem with the network or with a recent change in the code. So yeah, we actually to some degree want to be aware of these transaction propagation statistics. We don't necessarily want to bind or link IP addresses to a specific transaction, though. We don't care where it's coming from. We more care about if everything is working correctly, or if there's maybe something broken. And obviously, on the other hand, you have ISPs that currently can read all your traffic of your Bitcoin node because our traffic is completely unencrypted. So hope to have P2P version 2 soon. BIP 3.24, which encrypts your traffic of your Bitcoin node speaking with other nodes. So at least ISPs and governments can't check when you're sending and receiving transactions.
Yeah, I'm excited for the new peer-to-peer encryption BIP that has been pushed through and is possible now. It's definitely someone I want to have on the podcast soon as well, because they've been doing really good work around how we can protect ourselves more broadly from ISPs or nation states. It doesn't protect against like the kind of famed global passive adversary that sometimes we talk about when we talk privacy, but it provides a lot of protection against the very easy, low-hanging fruit of just monitoring traffic across the network and seeing what your node is saying to other nodes. So that will definitely be a big improvement there.
At least makes it a lot harder and more expensive to do these monitoring and observing of like the whole traffic on the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to dive into the now we've kind of seen the practical implications of it, what this entity could be seeing about kind of your node, your transactions. And I want to give people really practical, actionable steps that they can take to protect themselves against this. So I'd love to hear from y'all kind of what Bitcoiners can do to protect their privacy when they're running their own node, and what they can do if they're deciding to trust someone else's node instead.
Yeah, so definitely one option is to have at least Tor connectivity for your node. Either run it behind the proxy, the Tor proxy, or use like a hidden service. Bitcoin Core sets that up for you. Also, I'm not sure. I wouldn't recommend running only Tor. It might be a bit like you mentioned the ongoing denial of service attacks earlier. We also have support for I2PD or I2P, and there is CJDNS, which isn't really a privacy network, but an alternative you can use to make it a bit more reliable. And yeah, definitely recommend to use your node if you're going to make a transaction, and not using someone else's node first.
Yeah, I think I'll just chime in on the comment around maybe not running your node purely over Tor. I'm of the opinion I think that's fine for most home node runners that might be running, say, a Raspberry Blitz or a Ronin Dojo or Umbrella, something like that, which all thankfully default to Tor. Most of the issues associated with Tor when people are having headaches with the DOS attacks that Timo mentioned are generally where they're kind of connected remotely back to their node and they're trying to pull a wallet balance, which is quite heavy on the data side. That's where you can see the kind of difficulties. But if you're just purely relying on your node running in the background, connecting to a couple of peers to get the state of the network and then occasionally pushing the odd transaction, then I'm of the opinion that Tor is fine. The difficult bit is kind of connecting your wallet to that node. So if you have the ability to do that locally via your sort of internal network, then I would advise everybody to do that, because your kind of user experience will be significantly improved. But once you can get that transaction information to your node, generally speaking, kind of just doing the broadcasting over the Tor network seems to be working okay, at least in my experience.
Yeah, one thing to add there is Tor is a bit easier to attack, like to spin up Sybil nodes on Tor. So if you're only on Tor, I can generate like a bunch of onion nodes and the keys for the hidden services and so on quite easily. So the attack vector there is more the Sybil attack, and you actually connect to me. Like your outbound connections actually go to me as well, and then I can see like your transaction and at least cluster them to your Tor identity and not your IP address, but again to your Tor identity. So I don't think running only Tor is the holy grail, but maybe broadcasting over Tor transaction, or broadcasting your transaction over Tor is definitely worthwhile. And I think there are tools that allow you to broadcast, like pick out a random peer, broadcast the transaction, and see if it comes back over the network to you, and then like to disconnect after broadcasting the transaction and never speak with this destroy entity again of the same connection.
Yeah, I'm sure you'd open up some potential for transactions to actually fail propagation doing that, but it is a valuable way that you can protect your transaction from being directly tied back to source node there. The other two kind of key ways that I've seen that people could protect themselves this way. The first one ultimately is kind of dangerous because it can harm the broader peer-to-peer network. But since these attacks are happening through inbound connections, one of the ways you can prevent this is just not port forwarding your P2P port, that 8333, which if you're Tor only, you won't have port forwarded that over ClearNet anyways. But if you are doing ClearNet, that is kind of the default and often a recommendation, so that then you can seed the blockchain to new peers who jump on the network. So you can just prevent that by blocking those inbound connections, not allowing any, but that does mean that as new nodes join the network, there may be less and less peers that are available for them to actually pull down blockchain data from. So it may actually have impacts on initial block download and other things there. So that one is one that could be harmful, but is kind of like maybe a short-term step. And then the second, and I think you mentioned this in your article with the specific commands, but you can also just ban these malicious IP addresses right now. That obviously has the shortcoming that IP addresses are pretty flexible, so they can probably switch to new IP addresses quickly. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they do that rather quickly, since this has been published and getting some wide visibility. But for now, we can ban those specific IP addresses through Bitcoin CLI. So your Bitcoin node itself will prevent connections from that node. Anything else that you want to add there on kind of what protections you can take, or maybe some of the downsides that some of these protections could have if you implement them?
I think just on your final comment around the banning the IP addresses, I mean, that only kind of works while this actor, whoever they may be, is actively using these IP addresses, and it would be fairly trivial, if I understand it correctly, for them to kind of switch and then get around your kind of local ban, I guess. So that kind of fix, I guess, used in inverted commas, shouldn't be looked at as a kind of final fix. It's sort of a sticking plaster to ban the user or entity while they're using that current IP address, which is fairly easy for them to switch.
Yeah, I think it's curing like a symptom of it. It's not really addressing the root cause. And I think we're going to get into this later, but there are a few privacy improvements that we could do that would help against like someone monitoring or trying to monitor our like the addresses we know about and we send out.
The last real question that I had to cover was those future potential improvements that you briefly mentioned, Timo. Like, what are the ways that we can improve the Bitcoin peer-to-peer protocol and help to protect against these attacks? And if you're familiar with the downsides, I'd love to also kind of hear the trade-offs, because whenever we do any of these changes, there are always benefits and there are trade-offs that come alongside them.
So there has been a proposal called Dandelion a few years ago, and this has been reworked and it's now called Dandelion++, and there have been some modifications of it, like Dandelion 1-hop. And what Dandelion does, you don't spread out the transaction, like your own transaction, to all your peers. You only tell it one peer, which is supposed to forward it to a few other peers, and like there is a line of only one hop, like one peers knowing it from each other peer, and at some point one peer decides or knows it should broadcast the transaction broadly. So if an attacker would do the same listening they're doing today, they would find an incorrect or link an incorrect IP address to that transaction. Obviously, there are problems with peers being able to withhold your transactions. For example, if you see, okay, I'm sending only you a transaction and saying, hey, forward this to your peer, you might say, okay, I dropped this transaction. I never forwarded. Yeah, and on the other hand, like the other, I think, big problem with it, where at least a few years ago, I'm not so sure what the status right now, that there were some new denial of service vectors that potentially would be introduced, which we didn't really like, and in general, like the complexity of implementing Dandelion or Dandelion++ is quite high, and there should be, but there is limited developer time and reviewer time, so there should be. You should think about, like, is it really worth the energy of putting this in? Is it really like the holy grail? It probably is not. Again, I'm not too familiar with the status right now, but I expect at least that some some modification of it that's easier to implement might be better at first.
Yeah, and I can speak to Dandelion++ a little bit more as well too, because the Monero community actually implemented Dandelion++. I think it was the beginning of 2020. So we've been using Dandelion++ as the default method of transaction propagation within the Monero network since then. I think there was an update shortly after it was actually merged into code in January 2020 that made it the default for transaction propagation. And it's a very powerful tool for privacy, but as you mentioned, it does open up some attack methods. And one of the benefits of another chain than Bitcoin implementing these things in a live and in a very used and popular cryptocurrency project like Monero is that we've gotten to learn a lot from it. And the Monero community and the developers behind it have done amazing work in improving and iterating on the design of Dandelion++ in a live network that's undergoing active attacks. Because as we mentioned at the beginning, this same entity, along with at least one other entity, have been actively attacking Monero nodes for a few years now. I think it was shortly after Dandelion++ shortly before Dandelion++ was introduced that the Monero peer-to-peer network first came under attack. I have a blog post on it that I'll share after this, but there's some really interesting behavior that they can do to try to attack Dandelion++, specifically, like you said, withholding transactions is a key one, because normally in Dandelion++, what happens is you randomly choose one of your outbound peers to send the initial transaction to in what's called the stem phase. And then that peer will randomly choose another one of their outbound peers, and on and on. I can't remember the exact number of times that happens, but there's this stem phase where it's just one peer to one peer, one peer to one peer, one peer to one peer. And then after a certain amount of time, and that time is random, it depends on what the first node specifies. One of the nodes in the line will essentially do what's called the fluff phase, which is where they then just do the standard transaction propagation, where they send the transaction to all of the nodes that they know about. And spread it to the broader network. And so what that does is that does provide very strong privacy for the original node on the network, because there is no way to definitively say if the node that you see a transaction from first is just one of the nodes in the stem phase, or if it was the originator, even if you are the first one that the transaction is passed to. So there's strong privacy gain there, but that does mean that if that peer that you happen to select initially to send the transaction to is malicious, they can just hold the transaction and not resend it on. There is a protection against that, which was implemented in Monero, which essentially says that if you don't see the transaction propagated within a certain amount of time, you essentially just fluff it out and use that normal propagation method. But if you do that, then you lose the privacy protections of Dandelion++, and so then it could be possible to trace a transaction back to the source node. So there's a lot of complexity involved. There's a lot of nuance and trade-offs, and we don't have to get too deeply into the design of Dandelion++ here, but it is a very fascinating tool. It's one that's been helpful in Monero, and that's been really battle-tested there. So I would love to see renewed effort and research around how possible it would be to implement something like that in Bitcoin, and what the downsides would be to an even bigger network in Bitcoin than Monero there.
Yep, definitely agree.
Awesome. Well, any last things y'all want to mention before we go ahead and jump into the live Q&A segment?
Yeah, nothing for me. I just want to say thanks to Timo. I think this has been fascinating from my perspective, and I'm sure the audience has got a hell of a lot out of this as well. So just wanted to thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for being willing to join for this time, Timo. Thanks for jumping in for this episode of Journey to Sovereignty, and I hope you'll join us for our next live Twitter space every other Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. GMT. Joining us live gives you a chance to listen in, participate, and get your questions answered on the spot. Follow us at Foundation DVCS on Twitter to keep up with the latest news, get notifications when we go live, and much more. See you at the next one, and thanks for joining us on the Journey to Sovereignty.